Great. So feel free to turn your camera off if you feel during this part of the portion. It's totally up to you. And welcome. So tonight, this is our introduction to Microboards workshop. So we're going to go through the what it is, the benefits, how you do it, yeah, sorry, I just got distracted by something I had to agree to. So if you have taken a Microboards course at any point, one of our earlier workshops or at one of our conferences, some of this might be familiar to you, but I will do my best to try to keep it fun and light. So we will start because there's a lot of information tonight. What is a microboard? So a microboard is when a person with a disability comes together with their friends and their family, and they form a not-for-profit organization. They actually incorporate that corporation and they become a microboard, like a tiny little nonprofit. That microboard has one purpose, that nonprofit has one purpose, which is support that person with making decisions and living their life. It is a permanent entity. It follows that person throughout their life. So board members may change as that person changes or as that person's needs change. But key is that it is a group of friends and family, people who have a great relationship with that person, who wrap around to help them make those decisions that they need to make in a daily life. You may, especially in Ontario, have also heard the word aroha. That's the Maori word for love. It is also an incorporated entity. They're a little bit more familiar here in Ontario because the first aroha was incorporated by a family called the Bloomfields, who are in Guelph. And they're very similar. They are all about supported decision-making. They are an incorporated entity. You can exchange one for the other. However, we'll talk about Microboard and some of the unique features of it. They are not new. Microboards have been around since the 1980s. The first one was created in Manitoba by a family called the Weatherows, who were looking for an opportunity to something sustainable for their son. They were starting to get a little bit older. They started to think about what's going to happen. And they came up with the concept of actually incorporating what was their circle of support so that there was this supported structure for their son as he aged. An organization called Bella Canada built on the Weatherows' work. They got together and they expanded the Microboard's vision, the model. They formalized it. They trademarked the Microboard's name. And in BC, things work a little bit differently there. All of their funding goes through an organization called CLBC, and then families budgets are individualized. And when a family receives their budget, they have a choice of how that money is allocated to them. They can choose it to be managed through a transfer payment agency, so a regular and traditional supports and services. They can completely self-manage it themselves, or they can have it flow through a microboard. And if they choose microboard, they tick that box, they get connected to Bella Canada, and Bella Canada helps families create that microboard, helps build the microboard members, and helps with incorporation, and that is all completely funded. We're not there yet in Ontario, but it is a little bit different there. And they've also been operating for 30 years. And they have this is actually outdated. They have 1,400 microboards throughout BC. Some of them have been running for as long as 25 years at this point and have gone to that next generation of support. There are also microboard organizations in Australia, Ireland, and the US. We actually do a lot of work with Australia here at Microboards Ontario, and we were incorporated in 2018. And just a little bit about us. Our mission is to make sure that families and individuals have resources and tools and workshops and connections to other families so that they can learn about microboards and see it as a possible option for their family member. And our vision is that one day, anyone in Ontario who wants a microboard can have one. So with that, I mentioned it's a not-for-profit organization, and that's exactly what it is. It's just like a nonprofit that you may be a board of director on. It functions exactly the same way, just at a micro level. It has all of the same fiduciary responsibilities of a board, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. And those board members are really in a position of trust, and their primary responsibility is to uphold the mission of the organization, which, as I mentioned, is to support one person with making decisions and living their best life. There are all of the other requirements and responsibilities of a nonprofit. It needs to have bylaws. You need to file reports with the CRA, which is not a big deal. And you need to have support built in to run the actual organization. But again, we'll talk about that as well in a minute. There are a few setup expenses that are associated with a microboard. Just like any business in Canada, you need to incorporate that business. That costs $250. You can incorporate it either provincially or federally. We used to suggest people incorporate federally because it was quicker. You could do it online. And it did give you the opportunity, if there was a plan to move provinces at any point, if that person was going to move, that corporation would transfer with you. However, Ontario has recently made it much easier to incorporate. It costs the same, $250, and you can do it online. And other than a few reporting thresholds, they are pretty much the same, except you are only incorporated in Ontario. As I mentioned, a microboard was trademarked by Vela Canada back in, I think it was like 1989 when they did it. And they did that because they wanted to make sure that microboards and the principles of a microboard were protected and maintained. And for people who were incorporating what they wanted to call a microboard, even though there isn't a contract you sign or microboard police, it's hoped and expected that microboard members will align with key values and principles. The first one is relationships are the most important component of a person's life. Microboards are built of people who have a direct relationship with an individual. We all know it's our friends, our BFFs, our closest family who we turn to when we have a problem we want to talk about or an issue we want to discuss. So this is really the key foundational principle of any microboard, that it is people who care about that person and want to see them succeed. The other one is that everybody has the capacity for self-determination. Everyone can express their likes, their dislikes, what they want, what they don't want in some way. And a microboard helps that person express those wants, express what they are liking or not liking, or some of their goals, and make sure that their voice is upheld and is central to the microboard. All microboard decisions are based on a person.
Karen?
Yeah.
What do you do in the self-determination part when the person involved is basically nonverbal?
We usually a person can let you know what it is that they like, can let you can express their interests and their preferences in some way, whether that's through an alternative communication school or tool or behavior. Everybody is able to let you know when they're not happy or when they're happy. There was one person I can tell you about who was nonverbal, and unable to really express what it was that they wanted. But the microboard was talking about what was going to happen at some point when he was no longer, and I guess they assumed the person didn't want to stay in their home. So they were looking at residential alternatives for this individual. And every time it came up, he cried, got really upset, and would leave the room. And people are like, what's going on? Is he not feeling well? Because there was certain connections that they had with this behavior. But it turned out that someone said, maybe he doesn't want to move. Maybe he wants to stay in his home. And as soon as they changed that language, it stopped. And he was happy. So he was trying to tell the microboard he didn't want to move. So there are ways to support a person in expressing what it is that they like and they don't like, and what they would like. I hope that made sense. I think I was at all the decisions are person directed and person centered based on what they would like for their life. And the last one is everyone has gifts to share. Everybody wants to contribute to their community, wants to be appreciated and respected for that contribution. And everybody should have the opportunity to do that. So a microboard is very much about making sure that that can happen in their life. The other element is a microboard is a supported decision-making model. That means that a person's right to make decisions is supported as much as possible, and acknowledging that everybody has that right. It's protected under the UN Convention, it's protected under the Charter, and it's enabling a person as much as possible to participate in decisions that impact their life. Ontario is one of the very few provinces who does not have a supported decision-making model. We have what's called a substitute decision-making model, which basically removes a person's right. It's just like guardianship. And essentially, once a person's rights are removed, they are assigned to another person. Usually the family can determine who that is. And then there's other consequences later on down the road for that person. It's very difficult for someone to get their rights back once they're taken away. So we are, and you can see in that last bullet, BC, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Yukon, Alberta, they all have a supported decision-making framework. So we're hoping that, and we're working and advocating with our partners on getting the government to update its supported decision-making framework, or supported substitute decision-making framework, to a supported decision-making framework, because it's essential for a person, if the government wants to have individualized and person-directed supports and services, you need to give people the right to participate in those decisions. So the Ontario government's really at a point where they have to look at their decision-making framework and update it. So that is part of the work we're going to do, that we are doing as an organization. What is a microboard not? It is not guardianship. It is not a substitute decision-making framework. It is very much, as I mentioned, a supported decision-making framework where a person's voice is upheld and encouraged and listened to around what it is that they would like for their life. It's also not for everyone. It's just one option. Like in BC, it's one of 3 options that you can choose. It is something that may not work for every family. They may already have a succession plan in place. They may not have the time or the family and friend network to be able to support it right now. And that's fine. We totally acknowledge that it's not for everybody. It's also not for people with a lot of money. We hear this a lot, that it's expensive and that it takes a lot of time and resources. And other than your $250, and if you choose to have a lawyer help you with that, That can cost, that's a one-time expense, and it's usually around $1,500. The only other ongoing expense would be if you have someone do your taxes and do your accounting for you, and insurance for your board, which is something that we do recommend because it is a nonprofit, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So it's well within the administrative expenses that you can submit to government. So it's not something that is, I'm not going to say it's like not expensive, but it's certainly not prohibitive when you look at it. And it's also not a quick fix. It's not something that you want to do when you're in crisis or when there's a lot of stress. This is something that takes a little bit of time. It does take a little bit of thought, and you don't want to be dealing with incorporating a microboard if you're dealing with, you know, the death of a parent or some other crisis, or the illness of a parent, or some other crisis happening elsewhere in your life. You do want to do it when you do have the time to plan for it. Do you all know about Journey to Belonging? I'm seeing a lot of shaking of heads. This is the government, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. It is their 10-year plan to reform how services are delivered to people with developmental disabilities in Ontario. It is, I think they're in year 2 of this 10-year plan. And the intention of it is that people are going to receive supports based on their needs. Those supports are going to be person-directed and flexible. Services are going to be built on the strengths of an individual support circle, so by family support networks and their community. And what they're dealing with now is how they're going to fund that, because they also believe that families should be able to choose how that funding is allocated. So they're really their intention is to really turn things upside down. And instead of the traditional model of most of the funding flowing through agencies, they are looking at the possibility of flowing it to families and individuals, and then they get to choose where they're going to spend it. They may spend it with an agency, they may spend it with community supports, they may hire their own staff. There's a lot. That is the intention behind it. They've got a lot of hurdles to jump, one of which is how they're going to manage all of these potential individualized and direct funding agreements. So microboards really align with not only the intention and the principles behind their plan, their reform plan, but the accountability piece that they're struggling with, because you have a nonprofit board who has those responsibilities and has that accountability already in place. So we think it's a perfect solution to what they're trying to do. It's also a model that ensures equity, transparency, and flexibility, because you've got a high degree of friends and family who are involved. This is all about people who know and love that person, so you know that they're going to take care of them, and that the plans and the supports that are put in place are what they want and help them live their best life. I'm just going to check the chat because I see there's something in it. Can you claim insurance money on passport? I know of a facilitator, and we're going to talk about facilitation in a minute, but she builds all of those expenses into the passport budget. And she's had great success with having those being funded. So I know they don't cover legal fees, but I believe she has had success. I can follow up with you on that, but I do believe she's had success with insurance being covered. So what does it look like? A microboard is usually comprised of 5 people, all unpaid, who have a direct relationship with the person. And we do suggest 5 because that provides a variety of experiences, perspectives, expertise, and really allows for a robust point of view and robust support for that person. We know of microboards who've started with fewer because they don't have a lot or a very big circle, not a lot of family and friends around, but their intention, they've built into their bylaws that they will grow. They didn't want to delay the incorporation process, but built it in so that they could have eventually, I think it was 7 board members. So that was how they managed to at least get the ball rolling. The person supported is often a director. They have a seat at that table, and they are an active member of all the actions of their microboard. Not everybody wants to be. Some say, no, I don't want to sit around and talk about me a couple of times a year, so off you go. And some just sit in and listen and contribute, but a lot of people are members. Even if that role is defined for them. There's one microboard where the person was very reluctant to participate, but he's a photographer, so he started coming and showing his pictures, and he wanted to make sure Doritos were the snacks, and he has slowly contributed more and more to the operation of his microboard, which meets like 4 times a year. Directors often have a range of skill sets, but they don't necessarily have to. The most important thing is that they do know and want to support that person. But if you've got a family member who's an accountant, or you've got someone who's working in human resources and can help with hiring people, if that's something that the microboard is going to do, that is great. And that can be their role on the microboard. Generally, there's only 1 microboard per person. Like we said, it's 1 person, 1 microboard, and you're supporting that 1 person for their life. We have known situations where there's like 2 children who might have developmental disabilities, and the complexities of having 2 microboards was very difficult. So they worked with a lawyer, and they managed to create bylaws that protected each person's role in each person's life and each person's consideration, because you wanted to make sure, the biggest thing is making sure it's fair and equal and equitable. And we do know of some where the children are minors. So there's 1 microboard with the intention of it dissolving and 2 microboards coming into place when they turn 21. Some microboards are often supported by an independent facilitator. And I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. This is a person who is a facilitator. She is a hired staff. She has no formal role on the microboard, but she's there to support it. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, but some of the most successful microboards have had someone in that role. It doesn't necessarily have to be an independent facilitator. It could be a family member who is really good at organizing, who loves to do research, who loves to, look at legislation, who loves to make sure that everybody is well informed. But the most successful ones have had that neutral support of a facilitator. What's its role? As I mentioned, it's just to support decision-making and make sure that person-centered approaches are always utilized when helping a person make decisions around their life. It also helps to expand connections and deepen relationships because board members are there, and because it's such a finite purpose. Board members do find opportunity to introduce that person to new people, new experiences, new activities that help them meet new people, and also deepens the relationships of the people that are currently on their microboard. Its primary role is to manage the nonprofit. Because it is incorporated, a microboard can help recruit and supervise staff. It can receive and administer funding. It can enter into contracts with service providers or other community groups. It can manage all their home and residential supports. It can interact with all of the trusts and ODSP and the RDSP, it cannot manage a Henson Trust, cannot be named as a beneficiary of a trust, but the microboard can appoint the trust company or the trustee, and the trustee can actually be a microboard member, but the microboard isn't able, and this is just a legal thing, isn't able to be a beneficiary. It's also there to promote succession planning and transition, and we're going to talk about that as well in a minute and a little bit more around siblings. But because you are part of that board, as I mentioned, you do feel responsibility to not only introduce that person to new experiences and new people, but to think about if you need to step off for any reason, you move away and you're not able, or you have issues of your own, or your family life or your job just isn't allowing it, that you think about who might be a suitable replacement. So it is a perfect succession planning tool because you are always having other people brought into that person's life who could potentially be board directors. And it's also strengthened applications for support. There's been lots of incidences where people have applied for like residential alternatives funding or other project funding, and because they've had a microboard in place and because there is that accountability already built in because of the microboard, they've all been successful. So it is also a very persuasive tool when it comes to getting your funding. How does it benefit a person? We get this question a lot. It's like, what's the value of having a microboard for my son or daughter or brother, sister, cousin, nephew? People have a greater sense of independence and autonomy. They feel like these people are there. It's all about them. They get to make some decisions. They get to have a life that is independent of some of the other support measures that make people feel like they don't have as much control in their life. People feel more empowered to make decisions. Families all the time are like, I had no idea that my son and daughter was interested in this, but it came up at the microboard and I learned something, and we're helping them support this goal of theirs. Supports are always culturally and age appropriate, and they adjust as the person ages. Those board members tend to change with them, so it is always relevant to where they're at in their life. And a lot of microboards do start with, and this came up in a session we did yesterday, where microboard members are often the age of the parent, because the parent is usually the first one putting it together. But as siblings, cousins, other nieces, nephews come into play, they find that within a few years that there's much more balance of the age of the microboard members, and it's much more relevant to that person's life. But you have to start somewhere. People need more, I'm losing my words now. People feel more connected to their community because they are out, and because supports are community-based, because it's a microboard and it's comprised of friends and family. You usually just go to your community when you're looking for supports and services and friends and acquaintances. So people do have a bigger attachment to their community and their neighborhood. And it also expands the number of people in a person's life, which I've already talked about a little bit. And we didn't make this up. A couple of years ago, University of British Columbia did a study with Fellow Canada, the organization that formalized microboards, and they studied what the impact of a microboard was on a person's life. They were assessing what they called social capital and quality of life. And these are actually the results of that study. I just copied and pasted them into this slide deck. They're actually doing a second part to that now because they've also, the BC government has realized lots of cost savings. They ran a pilot with some other families. And so now they want to do a second part to that study that looks at cost effectiveness of microboards over traditional agency supports. Benefits for families and caregivers. It reduces pressure because families know that there's a plan now. There's a plan in place. They don't need to worry about what's going to happen later on. A microboard can also help with a lot of the responsibilities that typically fall to parents, typically to moms, but not necessarily, but because they can help hire staff, because they can help manage funding, because they can do all of these things, it helps ease the stress that a lot of families face and deal with on a daily basis. It also helps ease the transition of siblings. We hear a lot from siblings, and Siblings Canada has done a lot of studies on this, that siblings want to be involved. They know from a very young age that they're going to be involved, and they start making life choices at that young age where they're going to go to school. They tend to stay closer to home. They tend to not move as far away because they know that at some point they're going to assume that primary support role that their parents did. And it scares them because they don't have all the knowledge. They feel like they're not equipped to advocate for their sibling, to manage their finances, and to protect their rights, their siblings' rights. And we hear time and time again that once, and I'm going to show you a video in a minute so you don't have to listen to me talk for 5 minutes, where when a microboard's in place, siblings just relax. They feel like they have support. They feel like they don't have to know everything their parent knows because they've got this team of people around them who can help them ease into that role. The other thing we hear is that some people, some individuals don't want their sibling taking care of them. They don't want to have that dynamic. And so having a microboard in place, the sibling is just one of many. They're all equal directors around that table. So it protects the sibling relationship, which is really important to families. And the last point here is it reduces the chance of a person going into crisis. I worked for an agency for 20 years. I worked at Community Living Toronto, and I know and saw firsthand what happens sometimes when something happens to a parent and there isn't a plan in place, and a person's life can be turned upside down. But because there's a microboard in place, there is that consistency of support, there's that consistency of contact that helps ease that transition, reduce the stress of everybody involved. And circles can be vulnerable. Circles are amazing. They're an amazing thing. But when it comes to, they're usually put together by parents. And when it comes to a time of crisis, that circle can be vulnerable. The permanency of the circle is at risk in some cases. So it does provide a much more permanent support structure. Benefits for other microboard members. A lot of friends and family, and we hear this from microboard directors, a lot of friends and family want to be involved. They want to help support a family and an individual, but they don't know how. And a microboard gives them a way in that has a very clear purpose and has a very clear rule. So it's a really great way for people to provide that support when they feel like they don't necessarily have the skills to do that in another capacity. And just a second on independent facilitation. As I mentioned, this is someone who is a neutral body hired by the microboard to help support the microboard. So what that position does is it can often help expand a person's network or circle, can help ensure that there are ideas and opportunities to continue to expand the number of people in a person's life. They can help with the planning and administration. They can help with board meeting functions. They can help put agendas together. They can help with the some of the tasks of running a microboard, and there aren't many. Excuse me, I have a bit of cough that's lingering. But they can help with that planning and administration responsibility. They can also make sure the person's voice is heard, make sure that that person has an opportunity and that they're to express what it is that they want, to express some of their goals, and can help make sure that the other board members know and understand their role and remind if necessary, or make sure everybody understands what supported decision-making means, and make sure that that board is functioning in alignment with the values that I mentioned earlier on tonight. Independent facilitators often will bring changes to legislation, grant opportunities, funding opportunities, community resources to a microboard, which is great. That takes the whole problem of researching all of these things off the plate of the microboard members. And they can also, if any challenges or issues arise, they can help facilitate those. So I'm going to show you a quick video. This is Kathleen Gifford. She is on Microboards Ontario's board of directors. She typically does these things with me sometimes as well, especially in person when it allows. And she lives in Ingersoll. Her son David has had a microboard for about 5 years now. And she's going to talk a little bit about some of her experience with that.
My husband and I adopted David about when he was 3. And he became our 3rd child. We have 2 girls born to us who are much older than him. Lots of times professionals think that clinical placement is best for him, but David shines in community, and he's a beautiful artist, and he loves his town, and he chooses to be in the heart of it every day. David is nonverbal and has a global developmental delay, as well as autism. So those things really impact his communication, especially. So he gets big ideas, but can't express them. Even though he uses an iPad, it's very limiting for him. So, but he wants to be understood. So behaviors arise, and he has quite significant self-injury. So life always had to be sort of built around him. Supports had to be built in. So I heard about microboards many years ago before we adopted David, and I knew that that would be in his future. So he needed that group of people around him that's going to help with the custom fitting all the time. I think it's important to say that David's life was really quite isolated. So he didn't have a group of people around him. He didn't have that circle of friends that he grew up with. So he has his 2 sisters, his dad and I, and 3 former support workers and an aunt, and himself. He's a director on his own board. And so what I knew about microboards was it had to be people with personal knowledge and a relationship with the person you're building the microboard with. And so we knew that he needed that strength around him if we were ever challenged in any legal or medical decisions we were making. We could show an incorporated effort of supported decision making. In all this time that we're raising David, we never once had a family meeting about what happens after. And when we formed the microboard, or started talking about the microboard, we just saw our daughter's shoulders come down. And they had been having their own meetings about thinking that Terry and I, David's dad and I, were not thinking about the future. So they are elated to be close to his support without having to inherit the care and know all the they just felt like they couldn't provide everything that his dad and I were providing. So they were happy to share that with a group of people. We very much went into the microboard being mom and dad. And David's 26 and he was an adult when we formed the microboard. And so we had to adjust our parenting, because now that you have the microboard, it's equal voices at the table. So having that realization in real time in a meeting was humiliating for me and was embarrassing, and I felt like I was trying to control. And when I don't think my husband and I were really great big controllers, but when someone would suggest an idea, we would say, oh yeah, we tried that. Oh yeah, we tried that. What we weren't taking into consideration is, yes, our history with David is very important, but what we weren't saying or what we weren't admitting when we said, yes, we tried that, is we weren't admitting David's growth and admitting I think even David's voice, right? I mean, it sounds really subtle, but control is, isn't it? So I think we're better at board meetings now. We are less mom and dad and more the team. And the reward for that way of thinking is then you really, as mom and dad, get to experience the support of the microboard, and you feel that group of people. And you watch your son shine. I mean, those are big rewards.
So she's pretty amazing. Kathleen and her family recently had an experience where they had planned their AGM, and she won't mind me telling you this at all. She usually does when she's here. And they had taken them some time to plan it, because as a microboard, just like you have to have an AGM once a year, and they only meet 3 times a year. So it took them a long time to get this microboard meeting AGM organized. And the day it was supposed to happen, David had a medical issue, and Kathleen and Terry both needed to take David to the hospital. And they were like, do we cancel the AGM because we're not going to be there, or what? And they decided not to cancel it. So their AGM went ahead without them there. And she said they were really nervous, but the trust of the microboard and their response was, don't worry about it, we got it, go do it. And it was a really positive thing for them. Everything went really smoothly, and of course it was over in 15 minutes and they had a barbecue, but it was a really great experience for her in what it meant to kind of step back a little bit. And it took her, almost 5 years to get there because of other issues that were happening in their lives. But she said it was such an amazing place to be able, or to be there with her microboard and with David's involvement in it. So I just have another just 2-3 slides. This is actually Kathleen's slide from her portion of the presentation, because they live in Ingersoll, as I mentioned, and she has a very good relationship with Ingersoll Support Services, which is the local organization in Ingersoll. And once they decided they want a microboard, they brought Ingersoll into the meetings, and they're not, the executive director there is not a board director, but he is a member, and he comes to the meetings, and he's there as a support for them. And he's also there to learn and grow and find out what he can about microboards. So it's been a really great relationship for her, and it's one of her biggest pieces of advice is to make sure that your local agency knows you, understands you, and is open to a microboard, and to make sure that you are aligned with an agency who shares your values. Other ways that agencies and microboards work together, because there are many microboards who have direct relationships with agencies, not just because the funding right now has to flow through an agency to the microboard, but because of supports that are either being purchased or are being intended to support that person. But it's actually a great thing for an agency when a microboard is involved, because they know that there's a plan. They know that there's regular contact. There's a lot of people who are involved in that person's life. And they know that in terms of any direct funding, that there is that accountability piece that's there, which makes it easier for agencies. I'm just going to skip over that one. And then the last one is kind of how we can support you. Microboards Ontario, up to this point, has been providing support and training, as I mentioned, to families, to individuals, to and also to agencies and staff, because we're getting a lot of calls from agencies saying, hey, we're hearing about this. Can you come tell us what it is? And it's been really positive, those meetings with agencies, which is always a great thing. And we're at the point where we're about to support families with the whole incorporation process. Could probably be there in the new year. We're actually working with a number with Fella and with Microboards Australia, and kind of stealing how they do it and making it work for Ontario. But what we're finding is families are coming to us and saying, yes, we want a microboard, now help us do it. And by helping them from the point of I want one, to identifying their board members, to helping think about what should be in their bylaws, to how many times a year they're going to meet, to who, to all of those pieces, and understanding and making sure people who agree to be on the microboard understand what a microboard is and what their role is and what supported decision making is and all of the other values that are attached, that by the time they get to the incorporation process, they're much farther ahead, which can also help reduce, if they choose to have a lawyer help them, it can help reduce some of those legal fees that are associated with it, because all of this groundwork has already been done. So we're hoping to be able to provide that in the very near future. One day we're hoping government will pay for that, but we're looking at ways that we can provide that very soon to families. The other thing we've done is we want to make sure that facilitators who are out there, whether they have their own business and are independent of an agency or whether they work with an agency, making sure that facilitators understand their role in supporting a microboard. Because as I mentioned, it is a bit unique from traditional supports that a facilitator might provide. So we worked with Vela Canada and with Partners for Planning, who many of you may be familiar with. They have a whole host of webcasts and resources for families and individuals, but we've created a training module just for people in that facilitator role who are planning to go into that facilitator role, that is just focused on microboards. So they understand a lot of the legalities, a lot of their role, how to support board members, and all of the things that they need to do their job. They aren't trained to help them develop it. That's something that Microboards Ontario will be running. But once your microboard is up and running, a facilitator who's done this course can confidently support the microboard. And once people finish this module, they will go on our list and they will go on our website, because we know they've done this course and that they know that what a microboard is and they know what the values are behind it. The other thing we're doing is twice a year, we have what we call family connection nights. These are free nights on Zoom where a couple of families present their stories and their history with the microboard. Kathleen, you just saw in the video, she leads it. And it's usually two families who are at different stages of microboard development who talk about, how they got there, why they got there, how it's going. And then these are very short 10-15 minute presentations, and then people who attend can just pummel them with questions and ask them anything that they want to know about a microboard from that family experience, because you don't always want to hear from the staff. You want to hear from people who've been through it and how it's operating for them. So these have been really, really successful, and great ways for families to also connect with each other. And then the last thing we're doing before I turn it over to you guys is in April, we're having a day-long in-person family networking forum. And this is a day of families coming together. We're going to talk about some of the things around microboards. I'm trying to get a sibling workshop going. And it's a really great day to meet other families, learn about microboards, and be able to ask questions of not only us, but of some of the people we're going to invite to present and other families in the room. So with that, I am done. Thank you for your patience and for putting up with just listening to me. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if you guys have any questions, I'm going to stop recording. I can find because I disappeared it.